All right, let's dive into the world of energy stocks. Today, we're looking at NextEra Energy. They're making some serious moves, and we're going to find out if all the hype is really worth it.
What makes this a fascinating deep dive is that we might be at the start of a huge power boom. The U.S. is expected to need a lot more electricity in the coming years,
Right.
like a 55% increase in demand over the next 20 years. That's a ton of energy, and someone's got to supply it.
Yeah, that's huge. And to break this down, we're looking at an article from the Motley Fool. It came out February 2nd, 2025. And the title is pretty bold. One must-own energy stock for the coming power boom. They're making a big statement about NextEra Energy. So let's see what they have to say.
Before we decide if it's a must-own or not, we need to understand how big of a player NextEra actually is. I mean, we're not talking about just any utility company. NextEra is the largest electric utility in the U.S., and they're a global leader in renewables and storage. By 2027, they're projected to have more renewable capacity than every country in the world except for 7%.
Wow. More renewable capacity than most countries. That's hard to wrap my head around. But how does that compare to other energy giants, like in terms of revenue or their market cap?
Well, that's a good question, and it shows how NextEra is in a different category. They're competing with those traditional big energy companies, but their focus on renewables puts them in a league of their own. Their growth has been strategic. They're acquiring the right assets and investing in projects that position them as the go-to for clean energy.
I see what you mean. They're really carving out their own space. The Motley Fool article, though, isn't just about their size. They're emphasizing NextEra's performance. What can you tell us about that?
Their track record is really impressive. Over the last 20 years, their adjusted EPS growth has been more than double the average for utility companies. And on top of that, they've delivered a 10% compound annual dividend growth rate consistently. That basically means their dividend payments have been growing by an average of 10% each year, which is very attractive to investors, especially those who want to see stable returns.
It seems like consistent growth and a reliable dividend are their hallmarks. But for those who aren't familiar with these financial terms, what do those numbers tell us about their overall strategy?
They're playing the long game, not just chasing quick profits. They're building value over time, both for themselves and for anyone who invests in them. They're making big investments in their future. And that's what we're seeing reflected in those numbers.
So it's not just about what they've achieved, it's about where they're going. And the article focuses a lot on NextEra's plans for this power boom. What are they betting on for the future?
They've announced they're investing $120 billion over the next 4 years. A large part of that is to really boost their renewable energy capacity. We're talking tons of new wind and solar farms, battery storage, you name it.
Sounds like they're all in on renewables. But what I find interesting is they're not just doing everything on their own. They're creating some big partnerships.
Exactly. They've got a joint venture with energy, plus framework agreements with big companies to lock in up to 10.5 GW of capacity, and they're even working with GE Vernova on natural gas.
Natural gas. I thought clean energy was their main thing.
That's what makes this so interesting. They're not just focused on wind and solar, they're diversifying, knowing the change to 100% clean energy won't happen right away.
So they're acknowledging that natural gas will still be important for a while?
It seems so. And by doing this, they can provide a wider range of options to their customers. But it goes even further. They're looking into some surprising options.
Tell me more.
Well, they're considering bringing a nuclear power plant in Iowa back online, and they're even starting to develop small modular reactors.
Nuclear power. I honestly did not expect that. That's a bold move, especially given the controversy around nuclear energy. It seems like they're not afraid to take risks to stay on top.
That's exactly it. They're in a competitive field, and they're not shying away from making big moves. But to see what all these decisions will mean, we should look at how they're using their resources and what kind of returns they're generating.
Okay, let's get into those financials then and see what the numbers say about all this ambition. So they're making big moves. But is NextEra actually seeing results from all this? What's the bottom line for investors?
Yeah, that's what matters most, right? The Motley Fool article is really positive about NextEra, and when you look at the financials, there's a lot there to back that up.
So what are the numbers that make NextEra stand out to investors?
Well, their earnings growth has been very impressive. Remember, we talked about their adjusted EPS growth being more than double the average utility company over the last 2 decades. That's not just random chance. It shows they have good management, and they're executing their strategies well.
But investors don't just want growth. They want to see a return on their investment too, right?
Absolutely. And that's where NextEra's dividend comes in. They've been raising their dividend consistently for years with that 10% compound annual growth rate we mentioned before. That kind of stability is great for investors,
Yeah.
especially those who are looking for income from their investments. It's almost like getting a raise every year. But from your investments,
Okay, so we've got consistent growth and a solid dividend. That sounds good. But are there any downsides? What are the risks investors should be aware of?
while like any investment, there are some risks with NextEra. One thing to consider is they rely a lot on government regulations and incentives, especially for renewable energy. If those policies were to change, it could impact their profitability.
So their success is tied to political decisions to some extent.
Yes, to some degree. And another thing to think about is competition. The energy industry is always evolving, new technologies are being developed, and new companies are entering the market. NextEra needs to stay ahead of the game to keep their leading position.
That's a good point. Their past performance is impressive, but there's no guarantee that'll continue forever.
You're right. And that brings us to an important metric, return on equity, or ROE. NextEra consistently has a higher ROE than its competitors. This means they're really good at using investments to generate profits. It's like they're getting more out of every dollar than other companies.
So we've got steady earnings growth, a strong dividend, high ROE. But we also have to factor in the risk of policy changes and more competition. What does all this mean for the everyday investor? Is NextEra really a must-own stock?
That's the big question, right? And there's no easy answer. Each investor has different goals and different levels of risk they're comfortable with. What we've done here is lay out the important factors, good and bad, so you can make an informed decision for yourself.
Right. We've talked about their size, their performance, their plans for the future, and now we've even looked at the financials. But there's one piece we haven't really explored yet, and that's innovation. It seems like that's a big part of their story, especially in a field like energy that's constantly changing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What's interesting about NextEra is they're not just adopting new technologies, they're making innovation a core part of everything they do. It's like they're building a company that's designed to keep adapting and evolving.
That's interesting. Tell me more about their approach to innovation.
They're putting a lot of resources into things like data analytics and artificial intelligence to make every part of their business better, from predicting how much energy people will need to making their grid operations more efficient. They're even using AI to try and predict equipment failures before they happen.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. It sounds like they're turning their whole system into one giant smart energy network.
That's a good way to put it. And that gives them a real advantage. In a time when customers want energy that's both sustainable and reliable, NextEra is putting themselves in a position to deliver both.
So it's not enough to just be big or have a good track record. They have to be smart and adaptable. This focus on innovation seems really important if we're trying to assess their long-term potential.
Absolutely. It shows they're not just reacting to the market, they're actively shaping it. And I think investors really like to see that.
I could see why that Motley Fool article called them a must-own. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I think it's helpful to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I agree. It's easy to get caught up in one company's success, but we need to remember NextEra is operating within a much broader context.
Exactly. So let's zoom out a little and think about how NextEra fits into the overall energy landscape. So we've talked a lot about NextEra, their growth, their big plans, and how they're using innovation. But they're not operating in isolation. How does their story connect with the bigger changes happening in energy?
Well, one thing that stands out is that we're right in the middle of this huge energy transition. It's a shift like we've never seen before. The demand for clean energy is growing so fast because of things like climate change, new technology, and wanting energy independence. And NextEra seems to be in a great spot to take advantage of this change, with their focus on renewables and their openness to new technologies.
So it's not just about one company's success. It's about understanding what's shaping the future of energy.
Right. NextEra's story is interesting on its own, but it also gives us a glimpse of this big transformation happening all around us. And for investors, understanding this big picture is so important. It's about seeing the potential of companies that are not just adapting, but companies that are actually driving this change.
I'm starting to see why the Motley Fool was so excited about NextEra. They're not just along for the ride. They're helping to create the future.
And that's what makes this kind of deep dive so useful, right? It's not about trying to find the next hot stock tip. It's about understanding the trends that are changing our world and the companies that are leading the way.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We looked at NextEra's strengths, their weaknesses, their strategy, and even their innovation. But the big question everyone wants to know is this a stock worth investing in?
Well, I can't give financial advice, but I will say NextEra is a company I find really interesting. Their commitment to clean energy, their size, their resources, and their forward-thinking approach.
Hmm.
All of that makes them a big player in the energy world.
So knowing everything we've discussed, would you personally consider adding NextEra to your portfolio?
Well, I'm always on the lookout for companies that are well-managed, companies that are innovative, and positioned to benefit from these big trends. And NextEra certainly seems to fit that description. But in the end, the choice to invest is a personal one. It depends on what your financial goals are, how much risk you're comfortable with, and your own take on the company and the market.
That's a good point. We've given you the information, the different angles to consider. Now it's up to you to make the decision that's right for you.
Exactly. That's part of what makes investing so interesting. It's a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning, evaluating, and adapting your approach as the world keeps changing. And hopefully, this deep dive has given you some helpful tools and insights for your own investing journey.
I think that's a great way to put it. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into NextEra Energy. We hope you found it as insightful as we have. And remember, this is just the start. There's always more to learn and explore in the world of investing.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. The more you learn, the better you'll be able to handle the ups and downs of the market and make decisions that help you reach your goals.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, happy investing, everyone.